Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Yeah, so this is work we've been doing for a while on spectrum sharing. And just to give credit where credit is due, a lot of the images you're going to see are by my two grad students, Kate Harrison and Kristen. They're the main people behind most of the plots. Also a few from other students who've graduated, Mubarak Mishra and Hari, and a couple with joint work with George, who was a student of Venkatesh Salagram at BU. And I want to point out that a lot of this work grew out of a project which was joint with Howard Shalansky, who was a faculty member in the law school at Berkeley. So Howard was on the law school faculty at Berkeley. He was a former chief economist of the FCC. He is now the director of economics for the Federal Trade Commission. And he was under the Clinton administration, FCC, then change of administration, so he's at Berkeley. Now new administration, so he's back in DC. You know how that revolving door works.
Looking forward for a Republican administration to get his faculty back.
Yeah, I mean he was actually also had been a clerk for Scalia, so it's not a completely partisan thing. On the Supreme Court. So Howard introduced us to a lot of the questions from the regulatory side, and what we started off doing was trying to think through what would a research vision be in this area that tries to bring these things together. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to combine thinking that's non-technical. And I was told that I'm not allowed to have any equations, so I think I might have like one expression but no equations. There are some plus. It is to convey to you what the big picture is, what the question is, and what's an approach that we're taking to trying to solve it. So this is the problem, okay? This is not what you might think, what is this weird, this is like a piece from the Modern Art Museum, abstract. It could be abstract. It's not that bad looking, actually. This is the government spectrum allocation chart for frequencies ranging from 3 megahertz to 300 gigahertz. And the way that wireless frequencies are, so everyone has one of these gizmos, right? Cell phones. Each of these devices uses wireless communication, by which I mean radio. And it uses a particular segment of the radio spectrum. Like this, there are hundreds of different applications out there that use radio waves, from radio astronomy to Wi-Fi to wireless microphones like this, to television broadcasts, to maritime radar, to air traffic control on aircraft carriers, to the police radios, the firemen's radios, the various intelligence agencies operating inside the United States radios, the ones that are operating legally, illegally. Like there's a bunch of different radios out there. So if you want to drive by an embassy sometime, and take a look using a spectrum analyzer, it's interesting.
Did you know that the British embassy was in this building?
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, good. So it's very appropriate.
The what?
Yeah.
The British embassy.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So, and each of those different uses is allocated a slice of spectrum. And there are different kinds of uses are color-coded here. And this is the reality of how wireless spectrum is regulated today. The problem is that you don't see any empty spots. And that means it's full. So, yeah.
What does it mean when there's two things?
Two means it's allocated for two uses simultaneously. Yes, some of them are allocated for a couple of uses that are designated. For example, some of them might be marine for some things and land for something else. So yeah, some is allocated for multiple uses. And each of these registrations for uses then has licensees who are using it, who are authorized to use that spectrum. But the problem is it's full. And that would be perfectly fine if we lived in a static world. But we live in a world with Moore's law, and where more and more people are using these things for more and more stuff. So lots more spectrum is needed, or a lot more wireless connectivity is needed. And since wireless connectivity relies on spectrum, there's a big crunch in figuring out how to do this. So I mentioned in my abstract that spectrum sharing is an idea of having devices use spectrum and to share it on a basis of what's actually being used in a particular area, as opposed to this chart which is decided in Washington on the time scale of decades. And in my abstract, I said that spectrum sharing, and particularly a concept called cognitive radio, was the medical marijuana of wireless use, wireless research. Because for a long time, people were advocating that we should be doing this. We should figure out ways of sharing and having devices move from one band to the other and figure out what we can use. But it was all illegal because this defined the rules. And any device like that was illegal. So you could advocate for it, but until it was legalized, there's no market. What's happening recently is that this resistance at the government levels is falling. Governments are beginning to approve spectrum sharing, and they want to have spectrum sharing work. And the reason is that the demand now for spectrum has just become impossible to meet without doing it. So very recently, just to give you some background, in July of this year, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the PCAST committee, released a report on spectrum. And one of the things they said is that we have to figure out a way of making sharing work. It's the only way forward to get the amount of spectrum that commercial users need, while also preserving all of the very essential functions that are being done by non-commercial users, like police, firemen, and so on.
So, I take it that these things are allocated, but they're not being used fully, which is why...
Yes, exactly. The issue is that although this chart looks full, and when people do measurements in any particular location, they find that most of the spectrum is not being used. Yes?
So this means that if I get a license, it doesn't specify any time or location. It's always just by bandwidth for all times and all locations.
Great question. Some licenses are location specific, and very few are time specific. I'm not sure I can think of any off the top of my head. Some are location specific, so broad swath of area. Some are actually location specific of you will build your transmitter exactly here where you requested it. So television stations, for example, have licenses. So it's not like when you go to channel 7, that channel 7 is owned by the same person across the United States. For a given geographic area, for a given tower, channel 7 is allocated to somebody. And then the FCC has a rule by which they will say, at a certain distance away, so it won't interfere with the existing channel 7 user, they'll put down another channel 7 user who requests it. So yeah, they do vary with location. So the question is, how do we move beyond this world? And I think it's useful for people who come from a technology point of view to realize the time when this was made. These rules date from the 20s. This style of doing things dates from the 1920s and a little bit before that. So before the Titanic sank, spectrum was relatively loosely regulated. And then there was this problem of interference. The reason you have this is because there's interference. And people were worried that these transmissions from the Titanic and from other ships were interfering with each other, and you couldn't hear a distress call. It says, hey, we have to regulate this. We have to figure out what to do. At that time, spectrum was wide open. There was lots of room. And they wanted to encourage manufacturers to move to new places. And so someone would come with an idea that I want to make a system like this. The government would look at it and say, that sounds pretty good. Make the following changes, adjust this, and yeah, you've got a license. And then there was an international treaty. There's actually an international treaty on spectrum. An ambassador from the United States goes every 4 or 5 years to negotiate edits to this treaty, which are technical edits, like we'll change this particular band from this military use to this other military use. And essentially every country in the world has signed on to that treaty.
So the U.S. government will have a treaty with the rest of the world?
Yes.
This is where we will use it for military purposes?
Yes, the military bands are marked off for the world, yes.
Everybody knows
Yes. They're not marked off for exactly which military use. But there are literally military bands are specified in these treaties. And sometimes the US, there's some amount of variation. So certain bands are military for the United States but are not military in other countries. So there's some amount of variation, but the treaty tries to, and that's some of this variation comes from that. So it's a very unwieldy old process. But if you think from the 1920s to today, things have changed. Right? We don't live in the same world as the 20s. In particular, we have had the revolution of VLSI, right, which allows Moore's law for things to get better. We've had general purpose computers and computing. We've had Claude Shannon, which the founder of information theory, which told us that actually there's something called a bit, and whether it's voice or video or text message, you can reduce it all to bits. This was designed at a time when, oh, that's dogs. Maybe that's different from ships. The audio from different sources might be different. Maybe we can combine it. Music might be different than speech. That's the time when this was made. Now we think of, well, if you can reduce it to bits, it's bits. This doesn't acknowledge any of that. In addition, we've had a major artifact has been created, the internet. So when this was made, the idea of having connectivity ubiquitous around the world was not even a dream. And today it exists. So how should the regulation change to account for all this? You would think it's time for a revolution here as well. We've had multiple revolutions on the other side. You should have one here as well. So, great. When it was medical marijuana, then some people would opine that, oh, this should happen, that should happen, it would be great. Now the government says, okay, maybe we will change this. Tell us what you want. Crickets, right? From the perspective of the audience, because of technologists, because we have all kinds of things we wish for, but how to actually, write rules, how to make it actually happen, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So, and we're talking about a sector of the economy which is tens of billions, if not more, of dollars are involved here. So it's a big part of the economy. It's a foundations for lots of other things. So getting it right is important. So to understand how to solve this problem, we can't just think about a bunch of theorems to start with. We have to think of what the big system is. So if you think about wireless at a 10,000 feet level, you have government regulators who define rules. Then you have standards that people then build equipment to. Different equipment makers might make to the same standard, or someone might make to no standard at all, but everyone has to obey the rules. Then you have operators, people who use these equipment. For example, AT&T, Verizon, television stations, other people. And then you have citizens who use stuff that operators make, or they might use equipment directly. People don't speak radio. Okay? So people don't have direct access, unintermediated by equipment, to the radio spectrum. So the government can't directly regulate citizens here. So we want to make something work here. And the question is, what are we going to do? So what I'm going to talk about in my talk is, first I'll try to give a very basic perspective on what are the basic highest level consideration for what a good set of rules might be in a kind of pictorial unified framework. Then I'm not going to solve that problem. I would love to at some point give another talk which says, okay, here's a candidate proposal for how to actually solve it. But that'll have to wait. Instead, I'm going to talk about two things. First, something that's very near term. What has made the FCC move, where the momentum is coming from, is something called the television whitespaces. How many of you have heard of the concept of a television whitespace? Okay, so a few of you. I'll explain what that is. And I'll talk about one of the kind of very radical ideas that people are thinking about how this will be regulated. It sounds completely normal to you. I'll try to tell you why it's radical. It's one of these things that it's very radical from the regulator's point of view, but it's totally normal for anyone else. And then longer term, a way to get light-handed regulation. This is one of the big things that people are trying to go for. So when the government is doing these regulations, they know that their regulations have to operate on a time scale that's longer than the time scale of any individual device. And they want to create rules that encourage people to develop new systems. They don't want to necessarily just make a rule that's going to codify a particular system that they have a need for. So the question is, how can you make rules that are for not a system, but for an unknown system? And you want to give people flexibility and not necessarily dictate to them what they should be doing. The traditional approach, why? Because of Moore's law. If you lived in a pre-Moore's law world where innovation was a sporadic event, then you could imagine someone innovates, they come to you, you talk about it, you work it out, and you come to an agreement. But when you're regulating for a world that has Moore's law, where innovation might be strange and new, but it's going to happen, how do you do that? That's the question. That's the challenge that they face. And so what they want to do is to have something that's light-handed, so that people are free to explore what's possible. And what we want to figure out is, what are the limits on light-handedness? Okay, so I'll start with, how can you possibly solve, replace this with what? So first, I wanted to mention that what the PCAST report, presidential report, said is, you could think about all these different little allocations as dirt roads, little paths, railway lines, things like that. And we want to replace this, ideally, with something which is a collection of superhighways. So let's group lots of uses that can work together into larger swaths of spectrum that they can then share intelligently among. Instead of having the problem that says that randomly, this band is basically empty and this one is overcrowded, but there's nothing you can do about it, even though they're right next to each other. You want to allow some kind of sharing. So here, I've listed a set of possible things that the lawyers and economists think about when they think about new kinds of rules. One of the most popular that the economists really like is to have markets. Some of them for purely ideological reasons. They say, the problem with this is that the government's doing this. And the right answer is to sell it off. And then people will figure out, because I have magical faith in the ability of people to solve problems if they have a financial interest in doing something. But then, there's a statement that Christos Papadimitriou makes about algorithmic game theory. Any of you heard Christos' statement about algorithmic game theory? He said that, there's a problem in economics, which is that if you say that the market will solve something, the thing they solve, it better be computable. And his basic statement, if your laptop can't solve it, if you can't solve it sitting down, the market can't solve it either. And the challenge here is that, so theory is needed even if you have a market for how to structure that market and how to understand it. So the understanding is still relevant even if you are ideologically committed to a market. But there's lots of other choices of things that can happen. You could argue that instead of having a market, we should just certify devices really well, and then they won't cause any trouble. You could have a case where you say that, well, devices should simply coordinate with each other, and we should have central coordination through some database that will guide devices to do the right thing. How do you structure that? What can you do? There are lots of possible choices. The question is, how do you allocate? How would you think about what would be a nice set of rules? So I want to put forward a very simple kind of overarching way of thinking about this that I think might be a useful way to move forward. So let's just think about this, that we have, instead of those hundreds of possible uses, suppose we have only two. We have ISPs and televisions. We want to allocate spectrum, some set of rules that will support ISPs, wireless ISPs, and televisions. Assume that there's some kind of frontier that determines what you could do. Each point on this frontier is a different rule that you would have. How would you choose where to operate? In basic economic style thinking would be, well, you don't want to operate in here, that's for sure, because this is utility, so we want to operate somewhere around this frontier. Well, you say we have some preference, some utility functions. So some, let's say, convex combination of the utilities is what you care about, is your preference. So you set the level sets and you choose, okay, this is the optimal band plan that corresponds to this point. If you had a different preference, you'd go somewhere else. But what if you didn't know the preferences? And that's the problem that the regulators face. Because when they're allocating, even if they could figure out what the utilities are, they don't know what people want, because until the device is made, you don't know what the people want because they don't even know what they want until they see actual products to choose from. But you can't wait for the product to set the rules because no one can make the products until they know what the rules are. So the problem they face is one of uncertain preferences. So the question of designing spectrum rules is the question of robust optimization. Why do I say this? Because if you ask me to pose a synthesis problem in engineering, the only way I know how to even say it is now as an optimization problem. I don't know how to say it as anything else. So it's a robust optimization problem. So if you have some range, how do you choose something? Well, you can take the max-min. You just assume that whatever rule you choose, the people will complain the most. So they will pick something that's, tries to minimize, nature will pick something that minimizes utility. And you try to maximize over the rule. This is as good a choice as any. So I'm going to say, let's go with this. So if you do that, this is the particular point you get. That's max-min. This is related to, if any of you studied Rawls. Yeah. So Rawlsian concept of the fairness and justice is also tied to this kind of thing. Rawlsian position is, before you're born, you don't know which body you're going to take. So you have to choose the rules for the world. So you're going to choose the rules that makes the least well-off body you could be in best off. Because you don't know which body you're going to be given. So, you can just always calculate these optimizations based on the uncertainty. So now, I want to think about light-handed regulation. How do we think about light-handed regulation in this context? And flexibility in band plans. And for example, having a market. The advantage of having a market is that it can adjust after people know their preferences, not just before. So if you say it that way, it's like, well, of course I want flexibility, right? If you can give it to me for free. But how much are you willing to pay for flexibility? That's the question we have. Because if we talk about aggregating different users together into one band, they might not all be perfectly happy. So we have to figure out a way of how unhappy can they be and it still makes sense to do it. This is the intellectual question we have to somehow get towards answering. So if you say that you have only these plans, which are fixed plans, then you're stuck with this. So what you do is you should say, instead of min-max or max-min, it's max-min-max. So I'll explain what I mean by this. So if you had no choice, nothing flexible at all, there's no final max. So if this is what you chose, because this was your uncertainty, and this was your actual preference, this is the loss you incurred. It's tied to that gap. Now, what if I had a flexible plan? And the flexible plan was actually not on the frontier. It was worse for everybody. But it was flexible. You could adjust on this one. You couldn't adjust on this. So there's an overhead involved. Now, would you prefer this plan? And the answer is yes. You can see it clearly. Because here, under the flexible plan, you would evolve to this point here.
So in the flexible version, you're giving me the option to choose.
You can move. It can adjust.
Direction.
It can adapt after preferences are known. Yes?
So how do you make several agents share a spectrum band?
So I'll come to that. I'll explain that in the specific context of the television whitespaces in a bit. The reason they don't want to share is they don't like interfering with each other. So you make them share by controlling that interference. So one way of sharing is to say that I'll let you operate where you want, and I won't operate close to you. I'll choose not to operate close to you. That's how I share. And we find some rule that lets me work that out. But I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So in this case, you want to accept this. That's a good rule. But this flexible band plan, it's flexible, but you wouldn't want to choose this. You're better off choosing this static. So you're better off allocating half of it, in this case, half the band is for one and half is for the other. Even though you know what people might prefer something else, it's not worth giving them the flexibility. You'll lose too much. So this is like a way of thinking that I think might serve as a way of guiding us in making this decision. And what's a good rule? So what have we learned? We've learned that what we need to keep our eye open for is what is the overhead involved in sharing. And we have to try to understand what that is. Well, that'll guide our thinking as we go forward. So to make things much more concrete and specific, I'm going to start with, and actually legal today, and actually things are changing in the direction of doing this, the television white spaces. So in 2008, on election day, the FCC voted to legalize the use of television white spaces, and they issued a certain set of rules. Those rules have been updated since. The United States, having issued these rules, other countries which are watching closely have also begun to issue their own rules to try to do this. The UK has actually issued rules. Finland is issuing rules. The European Commission is close to definitely thinking about issuing rules, but getting close. Australia is looking. And we've actually been contacted. My student gets these emails from the Australian regulators and asking, hey, and they actually wrote in one of their papers, we loved your paper. Can you tell us for Australia what we should do? So it's for any of you who have students or are students, it's a great thrill for a student to get a mail or see someone who actually does something, right? Real, care about what they're doing. I mean, in theoretical groups, it doesn't happen that often. So a television white space, I'll explain right next. So this is a map of the TV reception in the United States, how many channels people get, according to official FCC numbers. Now in reality, this is an approximation, because in reality, there are mountains in various places, so you can't receive certain channels, but this is the FCC's approximation. I'm counting how many channels people receive in different places. There are about 50 channels of television. Each is about 6 megahertz wide. The first thing you notice is that nobody gets 50. Okay, even so you can see, Boston gets a lot, Bay Area, LA, New York, but here, not so much. But you can imagine why there's not so many TV channels there. But this is the actual. So people, when they first thought about it, they said a television white space is there are 50 possible TV channels. No place has 50. That means there are lots of channels that are not watchable. If they're not watchable for TV, maybe we can use them for something else. That's the idea of a white space. They thought of those TV stations are white, they're empty. There's no TV there. So the FCC made some rules. I can go into the details of the rules, and declared that this is how many white space channels there are in different parts of the country. So you can see lots of places have quite a few channels that are actually, the FCC says go ahead and use them. And other places have very few, and they kind of match what you saw before, where there's more TV. But you say, wait a minute, something's wrong here. No place had more than 35 channels before of actual watchable TV. But there are 50 channels. Why does Boston have less than 15 channels? Okay, so that gets to that's where things get interesting, right? The reason is that just because you can't watch TV in a particular place doesn't mean that you won't interfere with TV somewhere else. The reason you can't give everyone 50 channels is because there's a channel like in Rhode Island that might be different. So you have to watch out for causing interference there. And the other thing is there's an issue with adjacent channels. If you have a TV transmitter, that's a TV signal that's coming on the adjacent channel, you can't transmit on this one because the receiver can't filter you out. So if you were to transmit on this channel and you were right next to a receiver for television, it would lose the adjacent channel.
Then why are there 35 rather than 25?
Yes, that's a good, because I'm giving you an approximation, okay, of reality. In reality, the FCC assumes that some of those channels you're going to have a directional antenna to steer to. Also, that's one small, but that's a small effect. The other is that the FCC knows that you're not living right next to one TV tower while being far from another one. that the TV towers are clustered together. They're like, many of the stations are on the same towers. So they do monitor this for putting. So if they have two adjacent channels transmitting from the same tower, all the receivers are not going to be bothered. It's only when you have a strong signal from one source next to a weaker signal from the other. And the problem is, wireless propagating like inverse square or worse, if you're very close, like meters relative to kilometers, it's a huge difference. So anyway, the FCC recognized some white spaces, but with some rules. There's lots of debate about what these rules are, but it has these rules. So you might have noticed here this issue, right, of there's a lot of white space here. There's not that much white space here. But intuitively, there are lots of people here, and there's not a lot of people here. So you might think, is it just like completely correlated with the population density? And you can kind of see it kind of is, but it's not completely. So here we plotted, you can't see the label. This is the population density per square kilometer. And this is the number of white space channels available. So first thing you notice is that the US population density ranges over a very wide range. Where there's very few people, like 1 per square kilometer, there's quite a bit of white space channels. In dense urban areas, there's less. But it shows you that there actually is availability even in urban and suburban areas. So you might think, that's spectrum, what can I do with it? So here we ran a little simulation. We said, suppose you wanted to set up a hotspot that was like super Wi-Fi. So you're going to go 1 kilometer away instead of, like 10 meters away. Like 1 kilometer away Wi-Fi. What kind of data rates would you get? Of course, you're going to have to share per square kilometer, with the MAC protocol. So we kind of factored that in. So we looked at the megabits per square kilometer you'd get. And you can see, wow, great data rates all over here. And in here, okay, not nothing. This is not nothing. This is something. So you think, well, let's actually factor in the population. Okay. So here I'm dividing by the population density, and this is basically telling you where people live, right? Where people live, the data rates are much lower because you have to share. And where nobody lives, data rates are higher. Yeah.
What would that look like if we got rid of over-the-air TV entirely and just used it all for this?
Oh, I have a plot later that speaks to this. I don't remember it exactly. Yeah, of course you would get more if you got rid of over-the-air TV entirely. But I actually have a Pareto frontier plotted of taking TV channels away, so you can see it later. I'll skip this. Now, I want you to compare. This is a different model. Before I was talking about a hotspot. So I was thinking you buy for your house a access point. And now you share with your neighbors the spectrum by taking times with the MAC protocol. Another style is a cellular style, cellular data style. What's the difference between a cellular data style and a hotspot? The difference in a cellular data system is that you are sharing the cost of that base station with other people. So whereas in the hotspot model, I assume that you had a hotspot in your house 1 kilometer away. Now I'm going to say that there's 2,000 of you that are economically needed to pay for one base station. So the base station distance to you is going to vary based on the population density. So where the population density is high, you'll have a base station closer. Where the population density is low, the base station will be further away. Yeah?
That takes advantage of directional signals?
No, nothing directional yet. I mean, yes, actual base stations take advantage of directional signals. I'm ignoring that for the purposes of just illustrating the basic ideas.
So now the challenge is just to get our signal to the base station, and then there's some network which will take care of it.
Yes.
Okay.
But the economics dictates that you have to share. So the interesting thing to notice here is that suddenly the story looks different, right? The eastern seaboard before, right, looked really bad. And now it's not so bad, but these middle of nowhere places are now bad. They have lots of spectrum. Why are their data rates so low? The reason their data rates are so low is under the FCC rules, even with the low data rates, the signal can't reach 2,000 people because 2,000 people are spread out over 100 square kilometers. The base station just can't reach that far.
The absolute numbers here seem lower.
This is per person. So I'm assuming here this is a long-term average. So this is every man, woman, child, 24 hours a day, averaged using the data all the time.
Is that comparable to the previous slide?
Yes. Yes, that is comparable to the previous slide. That's the only reason this is, if I plot it for the hotspot area, I just want to show the issue here is just that these rates are astronomical. Right? These are just being dark by comparison, but they are lower. What I'm saying is when you factor this distance into it, it becomes more equalized. It's less of a broad range as it was before. And yeah, you can see that in the CCDF here. If you look at the data rates, by person, you can see it's like a power law for the hotspot because of the inverse power law for population. But hold on. Yes. So if you want to get more data rate for people, I always get asked this question, so I'll answer it. The way to do it is to have more towers per person, or fewer people per tower. It just pretty much scales linearly with that. That's the dominant effect. Now, I want to now think about the FCC. I was showing you before for the FCC's rules. This is our pretty good approximation of the FCC rules. There's like details we didn't account for in making these simulations. But that's one rule. What are the possible sets of rules the FCC could have chosen? So what happens is that there's a trade-off. The television transmitter is transmitting TV. You need 15 dB, which is roughly the signal has to be 30-ish times stronger than the noise for a television station to be decodable. Of course, it keeps going, and at some point, it's at 15 dB relative to the noise. That's the place where TVs could be heard. The FCC actually doesn't declare those guys as being protected. It says, those guys, I can't afford to protect you, because if I even sneeze, you're going to lose reception. So I'm going to protect only guys out to here. They never say what this number is. I mean, there's legal reasons they want to, because they have to operate within the law, annoying constraint that they actually follow, as opposed to the intelligence agencies. But these guys have to operate within the law, so they say, okay, we just say something like around here. But you could move it. You could choose to protect fewer televisions. But the important thing is that white spaces aren't free. These guys will lose reception if all the white space devices turn on. If the devices turn on, these guys will lose reception. But you could choose to move this around. If
that just cause the television station to want to put another transmitter for these people who can't receive the transmission.
Yes, they might respond that way.
Are they allowed to put?
They're not. They'd have to get approval,
Yeah.
but they wouldn't be able to, because if they were to put a transmitter there, they'd interfere with another television station. So because they're a loud transmitter. So the analogy to think about here that I use is, you've heard the story of, there's a vase and you fill it with rocks. Is it full? Have you heard the story? So you say, if I have a vase and you fill it with rocks, it's full of rocks. But is it full? Well, you can then pour sand into it. And this full vase can take a bunch of sand. And what's happening here is the same thing. The white space use, the televisions are like rocks. But even when the entire country is filled with these rocks, there's still room for sand. And the sand are these white space transmitters. So televisions transmit at the hundreds of kilowatts type of range, tens to hundreds of kilowatts range. These white space transmitters are supposed to transmit at the watts to milliwatts range. So, you can be the rocks are full. They can't put another one, but the sand can still fit. And what you're allowing here, actually, the analogy isn't precise because you have to kind of erode the rocks a little bit to make it work. So here is actually like a plot we made of as we varied these rules. So let me just point out a couple of lines here, just so you can see. There's one main message I want to make. This line here is what you get if you were just to take away TV stations and have an ISP operate in the free channel that's left. But no white space use. None of this rock sand business. This is the trade-off you would get by the number of this is the average number of television viewers by averaged over the population, and this is data rate, which you can't see. This is like, roughly 50 kilobits per second per person in this long time average. Everyone, all babies, everyone using the channels all the time. This is the curve you get. As we vary the white space rules, this is the curve we get. No television channels have been kicked off, but you can see we're actually reaching points that are better than what you can get by trading off. If we were to further enhance the rules and allow for have better filters so we don't bother the adjacent channels, then you would get this curve without removing any TV channels.
Sorry, when you're going down, you are removing channels, right?
Okay, I'm removing them. I'm degrading their reception area, but I'm not kicking them out of the band. Here, these is actually I'm kicking them out of the band. I'm saying you have to turn off. Yeah.
You said in the beginning that bits were bits.
Yes.
So why are you considering TV channels as being one sort of type of broadcast and users as different? Why shouldn't we just force the TV channels to just consume bits and then just have providers that just provide bits to endpoint users?
Yes, excellent question. If you have I'll take you in a concrete way. Suppose the World Cup is happening, okay? And everyone here wants to watch the World Cup video. Now, suppose you all take out your laptops and using unmodified current Wi-Fi, right, start turning on watching World Cup video. What would happen, right? You would not get it, right? There's 20 megahertz wide channel for Wi-Fi, and you're really close to the access point, right? But you wouldn't all be able to get Wi-Fi for World Cup HD video simultaneously.
This isn't Berkeley, this is Microsoft.
Huh? I don't think even in this room it wouldn't work. Not all of you, right? But no, it's just the nature. The reason is that you have there's actually a kind of data service which is multicast to lots of people, and you can think of the televisions as being kind of very popular multicast data.
So why not just make multicast bits?
Yes. So you could conceivably have multicast bits and have a different infrastructure that would support that as well. The current infrastructure doesn't do multicast very well for bits. There's lots of reasons you could make it better, but it doesn't happen. So there is always this other competitor that you should think about, which is the mother of all systems, right? This one system that serves all different uses, gives them all bits. And you're right. It would be interesting to plot on here how the mother of all systems would trade off, right? And figure out some kind of way of appropriately factoring in, making an apples to apples comparison with infrastructure cost for that mother of all system. We haven't done that. Probably it would do better, a lot better than all these, because it's able to make the trade-off at the bit level. But there is, right now at least, society believes that there is something valuable called broadcast television, which serves very popular content to lots of people simultaneously. And in doing that, it is more efficient than unicast traffic by a lot.
Although the numbers that you give us on megabits per person for many users are not what the end user really wants. I want to watch TV, I want to download files, I want to get voice. And
yes.
It kind of, I guess it's an implicit assumption that we have to stick with this intermediate technology.
Yeah, so actually one of the big challenges in wireless, which is the dirty secret of wireless, is that all these TV ads promise you these LTE rates, right, that are really high. You think, wow, that's almost like Wi-Fi, right? But in reality, you're sharing that with 1,000, 2,000 other people. And You're not all getting that rate. When they the rate they advertise is the rate that the one guy who's being served gets. They don't tell you that in their ads, right? But that's the reality. So if you wanted wireless data to everybody, the answer is you have to have a lot of infrastructure. You essentially have to have wireline points very, very close to everybody, and wireless is just the last 10, 20 meters for that kind of data, for the kind of data that you want. So it's a real challenge of how to make things work given that economic reality. So here we're kind of assuming that we're in this intermediate situation where we have one thing that people like, which is television, and we want to serve it, and then other data uses will also use it. Okay, so the moral of this is that there's an advantage to doing this sharing. You don't just want to have allocations that are to one use. So the question is, are we done? Is everything solved? I'm actually running out of time, so I'll just quickly tell you the issues that we've addressed. One is the whitespace rules as written forgot about the problem of aggregate interference, which is the problem that it's not that you're going to sell one whitespace device, you're going to sell millions of them. Oops. Okay? So they actually, we calculated there are people who are going to lose channels. No, everyone doesn't lose channels. This is just the number of channels lost. That if we assume that, basically roughly 1 in 40 people turn on their whitespace device and it's active at the same time, if that were to happen, this number of TV channels that are supposed to be protected will be lost.
So this is not a lot of lost channels.
Yeah, this is not, but it is what they're officially protecting. They are being a little conservative, but they are.
Dark is good news.
Dark is good news.
Okay.
But this is where people live, remember. Where people live, people are going to lose channels that are officially protected. So how should you deal with this problem? Well, you have to actually control the power density. It doesn't make sense to regulate one device. And this is where you see this evolution in how people are thinking about the white spaces and rules. When they initially thought about the rules, they wanted to make it like Part 15 devices like Wi-Fi, which were all you get told is whether you can use it or not, and you're just told a power limit on your device. But in doing it, they introduced this idea of a database, that you would actually contact a database and be told where you are, it's safe to use it. Remember, different places are different, so you can't just, device has to know what's safe in that place. So it's already contacting infrastructure to ask whether it's safe. What we're saying is, what they should do is contact that infrastructure, register themselves, and then have the safe power level change based on how many people are using it where you are. If nobody else is using it, your power can go up. But if lots of other people are using it, your power has to come down. The power density has to be controlled.
This is going to be controlled over time.
Yes, through time. Yeah, question? Yeah.
But then if there are many people who want to use their Wi-Fi or something, then you would have to reduce the power to all of them, then none of them could actually do anything. So would it be, usable?
Yes, so we actually calculated that out a little bit on what happens. It turns out that really, if a lot of people want to use it, and you have to reduce your power, it's not such a bad thing. Because the other guy who's using it is also interfering with you. So you want him to turn it down. So these two effects kind of counterbalance each other. And if you're in a dense populated area, you're not limited by signal propagation, usually. You're limited by interference. So you want everyone to turn it down together. It's fine. It doesn't hurt you very much.
What's the relationship between this story and what the cell phone operators already have to do within their own designated
Yes, the cell phone, they do control the power density themselves. They do it for the same purpose. They want to reduce interference to other cells. So this is not a radical proposal. Essentially, what the FCC did by allowing databases, they should just keep pushing it forward and say, let's not treat the databases as a way of answering a yes/no question. Is it safe to use it here or not? Let's instead view it as lightly managing the devices.
And
Yeah.
they didn't do this because
They didn't do this because they didn't think of it.
even though the cell phone people have been doing it for decades.
Yes.
Why?
Why? I can answer it. It's a longer question involving a little bit of politics and a little bit of the evolution of technical thinking. Because The database idea is radical to a communications engineer. Because for a communications engineer, when you have a band, the first thing you do is you establish a link. And once you've established a link, then you control a network over that link. Here we're talking about being told what band you can even use. So from a traditional comm engineer's point of view, asking a network before I have a link is like, what? I need the link to get the network. But that's because traditional thinking was based on the idea of, you're in the wilderness, man. You've got to, like, rub your wood and start your little fire. That's the world you live in. You bootstrap everything. But today, we live in a world of ubiquitous internet connectivity. And so it's not unreasonable to say, talk to the, I don't care. Get this information however. Get it through Wi-Fi. Get it through a cellular. Get it however you want. The communication engineering community hasn't fully accepted that. The cell phone guys don't have to deal with that in their engineering because they're a licensed user of the band. So if they use too much power in that initial reaching out for contact, it's fine. They will then be controlled down. The power will be controlled down. That's like one answer for what's going on. The FCC hasn't come to terms and doesn't even know how to fully come to terms with this new world. They're beginning to. And what the PCAST report is saying is, good move on the Whitespaces. Now push that forward to do all these other things. I don't have time to talk about this. I do want to talk about something else. I don't want to run too over. I want to comment on one thing you can do, which is once you're controlling power density, you have a new tension, which is the rural guys want a lot of power because they have to reach far away. The urban guys are fine with less because they have to reach very close. If you just allocated a flat power density to rural and urban, it turns out, we did the simulations, the rural guys are not happy with a flat power density. So you'd want to give even though they have fewer users, it doesn't counterbalance. If you want to make the rural guys happy, you have to have a tension of what to do. It turns out we can calculate an approximately universal power density by solving that same kind of max-min-max kind of optimization on a single frequency to solve this. And it's going to satisfy both the rural guys with high data rates and the urban guys. The other point is the FCC rules are all written on a channel-by-channel basis. But once you accept that you're talking to the database, you're not talking to the channel 2 database or the channel 3 database or the channel 7 database. You're talking to the Whitespace database. It knows about channel 2, 7, 8. It knows about all of them. So should it actually take that context into account? And once you think about it, once you ask the question, you're like, yeah, of course it should. In places that have very few channels, there are very few channels that might be available, maybe you want to make more channels available there by turning them off somewhere else so the aggregate interference isn't too high. You might want to think about fairness now. So what you can actually do, the way to think about it, is that actually the infrastructure, the people who are coordinating devices can be running their own simulated trades between regions. You don't actually have to have an actual trade. Why is it that you can get a lot done with a simulated trade instead of actual trading? The reason is that in wireless, you kind of know what devices want. Their preferences aren't mysterious and the user has to weigh in. You know they want spectrum, they want energy. You know their response, by Shannon's formula, you know their response to energy is logarithmic. You know a lot about what they want. And so you can actually do a coarse approximate preference to an approximate trade without having to invoke an actual market. And this is what we think should be happening. So we did a little toy with a 1D trip from Berkeley to New York and saw that there actually is an advantage, but I don't have time to talk about it. What's my I started late, so what's my time that I should end?
Say about 7 to 10 minutes.
7. Okay, so let me just talk about the next stuff. So hopefully this gives you a flavor for that there is an advantage to doing spectrum sharing, that there's new technical things to do. Sharing is better than just refarming. Databases should not be thought of as answering yes/no queries, but instead of actually herding users in spectrum. And we should incorporate the context, and we don't have to have an explicit market to incorporate context. So Am I saying that we don't need markets? No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that even when we don't need a market because it isn't that congested, we can still do better than just pretending we know nothing about the context at all. Once you move to having infrastructure, once you essentially have a cloud that can be doing spectrum management, the cloud should use what it knows to do a better job. And that there's a huge amount of research that needs to be done to do that right. Yeah.
Right, so tell me if I'm completely off base in this, but so I'm thinking of look, the problem is cell servers want more spectrum.
Yes.
This is the problem. And sort of everywhere, somehow things are rigid and it's not clear how to
There's two applications that are desperate for spectrum.
Okay.
Cellular
Yeah.
and flying drones in the sky that kill people.
Okay. Sure. Okay. So the government will do what they do. But then sort of the thing you're worried about is, okay, so we make this white space available, the cell company effectively clobbers it up, and and I can't I can't access it for my own purposes. And if we're really just trying to give the cell people more why don't you just, the cell people, they're the same people as the TV people. You can just say, look, here you go, deal with it. And a lot of what you're describing, I can't imagine the government keeping this database, blah, 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 but I can imagine, some of these big telecom.
Actually, Google is the database provider. Microsoft has built a database in Redmond. I know the guys at Microsoft, they are doing it. What they're doing is actually they're partnering with the private sector to actually figure out what these databases are. And right now, they've told them you're to answer these yes/no queries. But you can imagine, it's like not impossible to think these people want to add value.
Yeah, no,
so,
I guess interesting. Sorry, it sounds like you're just saying, let's privatize this thing. Let's sort of say, here's a big chunk. Does everyone agree that we should just let Google administer it? Everyone says yes, and then Google does something clever with it. And how is this not? This is how I'm interpreting this.
Yeah, the difference is that the primary users are protected. The televisions are protected. They are not going to get traded out. They're actually different. And also, the entry here is, the model is not pay to get spectrum. It's you want to use it. Sure, the cellular guys will queue up for it too, but you can also go stand in that queue and get the spectrum.
But no one queues. I'll be at the end.
I think we should let him continue.
Yeah, so it is, and there are lots of applications like smart grid and others that want to access this for spectrum. So it's not just the cellular guys. Yeah.
So if under this model, if I buy a hotspot, and everybody in my city also decided to buy 20 hotspots, I'll end up having a worthless hotspot?
The same way it is for Wi-Fi today, yes. And the same way it would be for cellular today. Yeah, this is not about magically creating more capacity where you have an actual resource constraint. If you're dividing up spectrum among people here, there's no magic. It's just trying to do it in a way that allows more people to come in.
Because if you have the database, I could
Can
buy.
I suggest that we should
Yeah.
go on?
Yeah, there's more. So, okay, you've all reached a natural question. I believe that to advance this research forward, as I'm concluding slides, we think about databases from yes/no questions to spectrum herders to a gradual transition, to administering a gradual transition to a market where there's actual congestion. If there actually is congestion, then you start having a market. But when there's not actual congestion, then you don't have to have one. So the cell guys even won't use it all the time.
What can we learn about the experience that LightSquare had with the GPS guys?
Excellent question. I'll talk to you offline about that. It's related to the second part of my talk. But I have speculation that I'm not going to comment on video. Okay, so. Yeah, I'll skip this. Skip. Okay. Just in the interest of having 5 minutes, I got a lot more questions than I expected. It's good. I like questions. So here I'm going to go a little bit wilder. This is like stuff that's actually happening. It used to be medical marijuana. Now it's not. This is still medical marijuana. Okay. Now the challenge is I want to have light-handed regulation. I don't want to dictate to a system that it has to do the following for transmission. So the database approach and the white space approach is if you're outside of this region, you can use it, but if you're inside, you can't. But what if you have a really clever intelligence scheme that won't cause interference even though it's inside the region? What can you do? in the current system and the white space system, you're banned from doing it. However, there's a good reason to believe that the right answer should be, if you don't bother anybody, go ahead and do it. And this, how can we enable that to happen? Well, this comes to an understanding of incentives and light-handed regulation. Basically, what you have to do is to say, we want to regulate in such a way that we don't dictate what you do, but we make it so that your incentives are you don't bother other people. So the traditional way of thinking about spectrum is under the idea of civil law. So people know the difference between civil and criminal law, basically at a very high level. Civil law, you get hit with a fine. Criminal law, you go to jail. Okay? From an economics point of view, there's a whole literature on law and economics. I'm not going to talk about this. You know, the question is, what do we apply for spectrum? And people say, well, obviously, spectrum is about fines. That's like the mainstream opinion. I'm going to be the radical crazy guy and say, no, maybe we should throw radios into jail. Okay? Now, we should have criminal law for spectrum. And you say, well, you're crazy, right? Okay, maybe I am. But the reason is charging a person a fine is easy. People already have money. Charging a radio a fine assumes that the radio has money, which is not obvious that it does. Like this thing, does it have money? It's a microphone. Like it likes talking to its reception. Like it doesn't. But I can throw it in jail. Right? How can I throw it in jail? I say, you're not allowed to transmit. You know, you got 20 minutes sentence. Right? And that's going to be annoying to the user. Having this thing charge me $1, like it's going to reach out and pick my pocket, you know, like it's harder for it to do. But it can be annoying to me, and then I'll have an incentive to buy useful devices that don't fail all the time, that aren't criminals.
But if it were criminal in the first place, why would it do what you tell them when you tell them you can't now transmit?
Exactly. Good. So this comes to light-handed certification. Rather than certifying that the device behaves as provable correct behavior in a network of unreliable nodes running a distributed protocol, good luck proving that, right? I only prove that when I tell you to go to jail, you go to jail. It's a much lighter certification burden. So can I make this work? At this level, it's easy to describe. And you might think, yeah, maybe this will work. In the course of the minutes I don't have, I would tell you that actually figuring out what it takes to make it work is lots of steps. You build a model, you try to figure out what are the considerations, what kind of users can we incentivize, when can we incentivize them to behave well. I'll just go to the summary of them, summary of points. It turns out that there's something called Blackstone's ratio for criminal law, which says it's better for 100 men to walk free than 1 innocent man to go to jail. That says that wrongful convictions are really bad. It turns out the same thing works out in the math here, that false convictions are what cause you overhead. You really have to keep that down. It turns out in spectrum, having purely unlicensed devices are very hard to incentivize to do the right thing. But if you have devices that have some home, then you can incentivize them to do the right thing. Because your jail, if your only choice is don't bother the primary or starve, then bothering the primary a little while, then going to jail for a little while is better off than just starving all the time. But if I can take your home away from you, then you're not going to bother the primary. So it matters that everyone has a good enough home. This turns out to be important. Second, we can't protect against primaries that almost are never there. It turns out it's very hard to create the right incentives for someone to monitor that this primary is there when he's almost never there. You'll just cheat and say, well, I'll cheat all the time, and when he's there, I'll kick me out to jail, and that's fine, you know. So there's a user or loser principle that comes naturally with this kind of enforcement. You can't protect primaries that are too delicate, that are like, oh, you bothered me this tiny little bit, oh, you know. They have to be a little robust. And you need this because otherwise the primaries will just feign being bothered. So what you do is victims should pay. Victims of a crime, the trial should be slightly traumatic so they don't false report. It's evil when you talk to people, but devices, you know. And given that you have these conditions, we can show that you can have universal deterrence that doesn't make many assumptions on what the device is, subject to these conditions. It has overhead, but it can be done. Now, I'll say one last thing about this, and I'll close for more questions. My claim is, if you want to have light-handed regulation, even if you want to have markets, if you have a challenge. If you have a device and you want to make sure it pays before it uses the band, how do you know it's going to pay before it uses? Like, it pays with right hand, some software, right, running in the OS somewhere. It uses with the left hand, right, some device driver here. How are you going to certify this? This is a challenge. So I think that even for markets, unless you want to have a rigidly mandated device that's totally locked down with, what's it called, like treacherous computing, right, where the computer doesn't obey you. It's got, something like really locked down. It's hard to do this in a way that lets people program their devices and be more free. If you have a jail that's kind of the very minimal thing in the device, then you can have a lot of stuff built up on top of it. So this, I think, is a worthwhile thing to look at. Final comment is about identity. If some device is bothering you, you have to know who is bothering you to send them to jail, or to apply a fine, or to do anything else. So the basic prerequisite for deterrence is identity. Faulhaber, as an economist, he said that all this spectrum sharing and dynamic spectrum use, none of it's ever going to work. We're doomed forever because of the problem of hit-and-run radios. Because you'll never know. Some radio a kilometer away interfered with you. How are you going to know? Right? So, and it turns out you can't just count on passive attributes to identify it. You have to design some identity system. We've thought about what that is. There's information theoretic problems about how you would do that. We're still working on the full characterization of that region. There's interesting problems, but it's some problem that has to get solved. So I'll conclude, since I'm out of time, that I think that light-handed regulation is possible, and there's a large program involved in trying to lay out what that is. Lots of specific things need to happen to move forward. There's lots and lots of research here. I like to say that wireless spectrum sharing is an area that has at least 15 blockbuster PhD theses in it, and hundreds of others, probably. Before the story really settles down into, here's the new consensus, here's the revolution has been completed, and now we're, building inside of it. Right now I've talked about televisions and ISPs or cellular type users. There's hundreds of possible uses. We need to understand what they are so we can figure out who belongs where. We need to understand what their preferences are, their natural preferences are. We need to figure out the full possibilities of what these databases and cloud-based spectrum regulation can be. We need to understand how to do this soft transition to markets. We need to know what for deterrence, when I say universal deterrence, I made a particular model of what universal is, but that has to be worked out a little bit more precisely. You would understand it better if I had explained that better to you. There's a question of aggregate interference. How do you deter aggregate interference? There's how do you do learning? And this problem of eternal. How many of you have heard the term eternal September? Okay, so I might be the last generation of people who existed before eternal September. Eternal September, so it used to be that the dominant users of the internet were college kids. And they would come, and they wouldn't know the cultural norms. And in September, all the message boards would be filled with people posting inane things. And then, they would learn the norms, and then everything would be fine. But then, one day, it was eternal September, right? Newbies keep coming, and the trolls exist forever, and this we live in eternal September, sort of after 1994 or 95. So how do we think about the equivalent problem with radios when new radios are continuously coming online and have to learn? What do we do? Yeah, and there's information theory problems as well. Okay, I'll stop. Sorry for going a minute or two over.
I'm going to ask a bunch of of questions, but I'll still allow 2 more, and then we go to reception and we find out the answer to the light square question.
Yes, I'll answer the light square. Yeah, it's a good question.
All right, any others? Or?
So most of the talk is going to focus on TV Whitespace and what happens if we share that. So, but how big of a range of this chart you showed us at the beginning of the talk is actually occupied by TV spectrum, and what about the other pieces of spectrum? Is there a white space in those that could also be shared?
Great question. The TV white space was considered the absolutely prime real estate for spectrum sharing because it's about 300 plus megahertz of spectrum in absolutely prime territory, meaning you could run cellular type systems there. It's right next to the cellular bands. So it's a good chunk of spectrum, and it's very important.
Can you show us where that is in the picture?
I can tell you. I don't want to go back to the picture. It's like it's roughly 100 megahertz to. It's spread out between 100 megahertz and 600 something megahertz. That's the TV bands. 700 megahertz was a recent auction of cellular, and a lot of cellular systems sit above that at 800. So this is really good. Lower frequencies usually propagate better through buildings. So this TV signals are that way because they can enter people's houses. So it's a really important space. There's lots and lots of military and public safety spectrum, gigahertz of it, that are sitting around above that. There are huge white spaces there. The difference is the white spaces there are also in time. They're not so much in space. So if there's an earthquake in Berkeley, a terrorist attack in Boston, or the president shows up, then a lot of that spectrum gets used. But normally, thankfully, most of the time, the public safety spectrum is not heavily used because most people are law-abiding and aren't crimes going on all the time. So there's lots of white spaces in these spectrum, in a lot of the spectrum. Other spectrum are almost always free, like the Navy spectrum. Usually there aren't warships off the coast. So there are white spaces everywhere in the spectrum. The question is how to make it legal to use them and how to set it up. And there are interesting questions about the trade-off between security and privacy and information obfuscation, crypto-related questions on how to secure. For example, the Navy doesn't want to register where all of its ships are. The CIA doesn't want to register where all their agents are walking around. So how do you hide the locations of these things while also allowing the spectrum to be used? There are good questions there as well.
Isn't most of the spectrum you discussed just recently being used incredibly wastefully? Public safety, how much spectrum do they actually need? They use modern technology, isn't a huge part of the problem to give these people an incentive to move into the 21st century?
That's a great question. On one level, the answer to public safety is they will use as much spectrum as you give them.
What for?
Because, I'll describe something. When I was an undergraduate, how many police were walking around campuses, and if there was a protest, who would show up? Okay, a few people would show up. Now, at Berkeley, there's a protest, and you have, they were considering buying a tank, right? No, to coordinate all those people's radios.
All of Alameda shows up.
Right, all the people.
I was at Berkeley when they had the free speech movement. That was in 1964.
Yes, but now they all have radios.
It's not any bigger deal than that now.
No, but the scale of the responses, the public. So one is there's a simple issue.
They send a lot more cops.
They send a lot more cops. There's like a wall of cops. I was at a protest in the BART station. Maybe I shouldn't record this. That was called by Anonymous, and there was 20 of us and 50 cops. Okay, so at one level, public safety feels that they need a lot more spectrum because they're using it a lot more. And now they want to have real-time video going from all over the place. Public safety wants its own UAVs. Let me be more precise. Defense contractors want to sell UAVs to public safety. Okay? So, in that sense, there's a vast demand for spectrum usage by that sector as well. We shouldn't discount it. It's true, some of the usage right now is inefficient. They use things like FM. But a few contractors who've tried to sell supposedly more modern equipment to them find they cannot match the usage characteristics, quality and reliability characteristics of FM.
All right, so let's thank Anant, and there's a reception out here.